the author of several articles arguing for Black reparations, and you can find a lot of listings and publications out there online on him. Arguing against the proposition is Richard Epstein, the Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of Law at the NYU School of Law. He's also a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's also a senior lecturer for the University of Chicago. He is also the author of several articles arguing against Black reparations, and you can find a lot of his publications online as well. All right, a little housekeeping here. For those of you watching the live stream right now, this broadcast, I'd like to bring your attention to the link right there at our pre-debate poll on reparations. We want to know what you think, so please fill out that poll. That'll be closing here in just a few minutes. You'll also have a chance at the end of this debate to cast your vote on reparations after hearing from speakers from both sides. Now, there will be 4 rounds to today's debate, and I want to explain the format as to how we're going to do this. All right, our first round, in round 1, each speaker will have 10 minutes to lay out their position on reparations, starting with the affirmative side. Then we'll move on to round 2. Now, in round 2, each speaker will then have 5 minutes to reply to the points of the other speaker and also clarify their position. In round 3, the speakers will have an opportunity to actually ask each other questions and speak directly to one another's points and also to one another's clarifications. Now, in the final round, the audience, you will play a big role in this. You'll have an opportunity to ask our speakers questions. You can also enter your questions there at any time through the chat there on the U of H live stream site, and you can put those questions there as soon as we start speaking or as soon as you start hearing speakers from both sides. So don't be afraid to go ahead and put those questions in right there on the U of H live stream site as we begin the debate. All right, here we go, friends. We're going to start with round 1, our opening statement on the affirmative side. Mr. Ray, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Chauncy. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Definitely want to thank ABC 13 in Houston, as well as the Hobby School of Public Affairs for hosting this, as well as to my debater here. I want to start off with a quote. "We have come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come marked insufficient funds, where we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt." Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made that quote in his classic I Have a Dream speech, which he gave in 1963 in Washington, D.C. Dr. King was firmly in favor of reparations. So I want to be clear about why we're here today. We are here because a debt is owed, and reparations are about paying that debt. Given the lingering legacy of slavery on the racial wealth gap, the monetary value we know that was placed on the enslaved Blacks, the fact that other groups have received reparations, and the fact that Blacks were originally awarded reparations only to have them rescinded, provide overwhelming evidence that it is time to pay reparations to the descendants of enslaved Black people. Making the American dream an equitable reality demands that the same US government that denied wealth to Blacks restore that deferred wealth through reparations to their descendants. I want to address a few questions right up front. First, why are reparations necessary? Some broad statistics from the National Museum for African American History and Culture in DC. If you haven't gone yet, you should do that. But some of these stats are of import here related to American slavery. First, 12.5 million Black people were shipped in chains from Western Africa to the Americas. About 15% of the enslaved died during transport, mostly due to brutal physical treatment and suffocation, but also through acts of resistance, such as fighting back, jumping into the Atlantic, and refusing to eat. Here goes the monetary values that's important. $25 million was the amount of bank credit issued from mortgages that used enslaved Blacks as collateral to purchase the state of Louisiana in 1859. We know about the Louisiana Purchase, but that particular detail is oftentimes left off. $29 million was the value placed on cotton produced by enslaved Blacks in 1822. 1822, $29 million. $250 million was the value placed on cotton produced by enslaved Blacks in 1861. We can see the inflation rate related to cotton. And we also know that into the late 1800s and early 1900s, that as cotton production started to wane, lynchings also increased, which were correlated, obviously, as people were acting out in terms of their economic woes. Here's the big number. Over $3 billion was the value assigned to the physical bodies of enslaved Black Americans to be used as free labor in production. That was in 1860. This was more money at the time that was invested in factories and railroads combined. Slavery also enriched white slave owners and their descendants, and it fueled the country's economy while suppressing wealth building strategies for the enslaved. The United States has yet to compensate the descendants of enslaved Black Americans for their labor. Slavery also disrupted families, as 1 in 3 marriages were split up due to slaves being sold, and 1 in 5 children were separated from their parents. So again, when we define reparations, reparations is a system of redress for egregious injustices. And reparations is not a foreign act to the United States. Native Americans have received land and billions of dollars for various benefits and programs for being forcibly exiled from their native lands. That should have happened. Japanese Americans received $1.5 billion for being interned during World War II. That also should have happened. And additionally, the United States, via the Marshall Plan, helped to ensure that Jews receive reparations for the Holocaust, including making various investments over time, when in 1952, West Germany agreed to pay $3.45 billion in Deutsche Marks to Holocaust survivors. That should have happened as well, and the United States should have continued, as they've done, to ensure that those payments are made. This is the bottom line. Black Americans are the only group that has not received reparations for state-sanctioned racial discrimination, while slavery afforded some white families the ability to accrue tremendous wealth multiple times over. And we should note that slavery was particularly brutal. So as my Brookings colleague, Andre Perry, often says, the United States is not against reparations. It is just against reparations for Black people. Accordingly, it's important to note a few missed opportunities. The big one is 40 acres and a mule. People hear that term, they oftentimes don't know where it comes from. We'll see right after the Civil War, where finally, based on Juneteenth, we know that some of the last enslaved people found out that they were free down in Texas in Galveston, that this was the first opportunity for the United States to get it right. Union leaders, including General William Sherman, concluded that each Black family should receive 40 acres. Sherman signed what was known as Field Order 15 and allocated 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land that was formerly enslaved land to Black families. Additionally, Black families, each Black family was supposed to receive a mule that was left over from the war, hence 40 acres and a mule. Yet, after President Lincoln was assassinated, President Johnson reversed Field Order 15 and returned land back to slave owners. Instead of giving Blacks the means to support themselves, the federal government empowered former slave owners, including in Washington, D.C., where slave owners were actually paid reparations for lost property, that lost property being formerly enslaved people, and that practice was put in place in nearby states. Many Blacks were then forced to go back and work as sharecroppers on the same land where they were once enslaved. So we see multiple times over how that happens. Let's fast forward to another time period in which it could have happened. Let's talk about the New Deal during the Great Depression, where Franklin Roosevelt was president, one of my favorite presidents, but this is where he got it wrong. President Roosevelt ushered us into what we know to be the middle class today by investing $50 billion in New Deal policies. That's currently estimated to be $50 trillion. There were 2 key policies here dealing with the GI Bill and Social Security. See, this is also for people who try to say, well, my family wasn't around during slavery. Yeah, but oftentimes, if you're an immigrant, your family was probably around during the time of the Great Depression. And that's of note. When we talk about the GI Bill, there were white soldiers, Black soldiers fighting together. Individuals like some of my ancestors who were fighting for our freedoms. And yet when they returned from war, veterans were able to receive money to go to college, money to send their children to college, money to start up businesses, and also money to put down on holds. These were grants that they did not have to pay back that was due them. However, white veterans received that money and Black veterans did not. Likewise, when we talk about Social Security, the way that it was originally set up, there were two occupations excluded from Social Security. That was domestic work and farm work. 75% of Black people who worked in the South worked in those occupations because Black people were still relegated to those jobs just like they were during slavery. That was another opportunity for the United States to get it right, and instead we missed it. So look, as I get ready to close, what should reparations look like? Well, look, we know the monetary value based on put on Black people. We know the productivity rate of what was put on them. And we also know that when it comes to thinking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a federal reparations package for Black Americans is in order. This package should include individual and collective public benefits that not only include direct cash payments, but also a focus on education, home ownership, and business ownership in form of a 21st century New Deal. First, education needs to be taken into account. The average white family today has 10 times the amount of wealth as the average Black family. And education does little to close that gap. Black college graduates have 7 times less wealth than the average white college graduates. These are people who have done everything people told them to do. So accordingly, based on all the things we know about housing and how equity works, and also the fact that people who attend HBCUs get subprime loans, that we need to focus on 4- and 2-year colleges for tuition payments and also for student loan repayment. Second, when we talk about housing, we know that appraisals are still a big issue. We know about redlining. Accordingly, we know that 50% of people's wealth is oftentimes wrapped up in their homes, wealth that Black people can't get, even when they've done everything they were supposed to do. So part of a reparations package should include down payment assistance and also housing revitalization to restore some of these communities. Finally, we need business ownership grants. One thing we know, particularly during COVID, is that a large percentage of Black families or Black small businesses were completely left out of the initial COVID funding. So much so that 41% of Black during COVID, according to a Stanford University study. What needs to happen is management, and then we also need to ensure that small businesses get the type of land that they need. Let me close with another quote. As Congresswoman Barbara Lee stated in her resolution on truth and reconciliation, contemporary social science, medical science, and the rapidly expanding use of artificial intelligence and social media reveal the cost and potential threats to our democracy if we continue to allow unhealed, entrenched divisions to be ignored and exploited. For those wanting to tell their children that they were on the right side of history and did the right thing in this moment, now is the time to truly show your true morality and what it means to be an advocate and what it means to be a true American by paying reparations to Black Americans so that we can finally heal and get past systemic racism.
Mr. Ray, thank you. We want to move to the opening statement on the opposing side. Mr. Epstein, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much. Let me begin by trying to figure out how we put this in some kind of larger context. What Rashawn has done in this situation is to talk about all the things that happened with respect to the slavery and other situations, as if it were every white person to some extent, every American that was responsible for these things. And there's no particular such discussion there about the complications associated with several factors. One is that if you start looking at the way this history ran, it's very much more complicated than one would start to say. So to begin with the fact of the Civil War, there were several 100,000 Northern American whites who were killed during the Civil War in an effort to end slavery in the South. They have descendants as well. Many of them paid for this in blood. And so the question that one has to ask is whether or not the descendants of those people who did everything they could within their power in order to end the scourge of slavery now owe reparations upon top of the ultimate sacrifice that they made under these circumstances. And I think it's extremely difficult to make that kind of claim. Then, of course, it turns out that there are many Americans who came to this country long after slavery was abolished, many Americans who came and worked very actively in the civil rights movement in order to abolish many of the situations that had taken place. If you start looking at all of those kinds of things, it becomes very hard to say why it is that there's a collective responsibility when it turns out that so many individuals who are part of our polity have done everything that they could in order to come out on the other side of that question. I think a second question that you want to do is to set some measure of Black progress under these circumstances. The figure that I like to use the most in dealing with this issue is the question of life expectancy. And if you take that number in 1900, which is in the period of Jim Crow, Average life expectancies of Black individuals was in the neighborhood of 31, 32 years of age. For white people, it was 47, 48 years. That gap has largely closed. And the close, it's not because of the particular programs that created impediments. It's because the vast transformation in American culture in the time that started in 1900 to the present has resulted in an unleashing of Black talent, which essentially has allowed things to equalize in a certain way. Wealth patterns, of course, are different, but so are consumption patterns. And in fact, if you check consumption patterns with respect to white and Black individuals in given kinds of industries, you tend to see a fairly systematic difference in the terms of their willingness to save as opposed to their willingness to spend. That cannot be attributed to something that you want to call systemic, and that's a question of individual choices. All of us are entitled to make them, and if you want higher consumption today, you're going to end up with lower rates of benefits tomorrow. Then what you also have to do on this situation is to compare this to other kinds of situations in which we've had situations of compensation. Rashawn mentions quite properly that there was 40 acres and a mule. This was 40 acres and a mule promised to all the individuals who were slaves at the time that slavery was over. He also mentioned the situation that took place in Germany after the Holocaust, where in fact there were 6 million Jewish people who were killed, and there were probably 1 million survivors in fragmented situations. The compensation that was given was not given to descendants 8 generations later. It was given to the very individuals who had been victimized by these situations. It was well understood that there was no way you could compensate families that were completely wiped out. And the payment for Israel, which was rather substantial at the time, was essentially an effort to try and provide compensation to a nation, which would serve as a rough proxy that you had with respect to the individual losses. We also heard reference made to the situation with respect to the Japanese internment camps, which was another kind of horrific type situation, though no near as bad as slavery. And again, when that took place in 1988, it took place with respect to only those people who were survivors of the particular program. No money under those circumstances was allocated to descendants, many of whom had done very well with respect to their own lives, and it was thought to be utterly inappropriate. It's also clear when you made these kinds of compensation programs, the only thing that you did was to give cash to people or kind benefits to people who were the direct victims of that. Nobody thought that the doctrine of reparations was something which required you to make major structural changes in the way in which one ought to work an economy. And it's here I think I do disagree quite profoundly with Rashawn in the way in which he tries to attribute the difficulties associated with the modern situation. I do not think, for the most part, that a claim of systematic racism is going to work. In order for that to work, you have to have some systematic racism. And it turns out, if you look in the United States at the height of segregation, lasting until the 1950s and so forth, it was easy to target the people whom you think were wrong. But if you try to figure out today whether or not there's a consensus, the overwhelming power of the diversity movement suggests that there are very few systematic racists in positions of any kind of power or whatsoever. So the question then is, what are you going to attribute some of the differentials to? And I think Rashawn is correct to say that there have been certainly educational deficits and so forth. But if you start going back to the history, what you discover is that the kind of relationships that you had start getting worse after 1950 than they were perhaps 50 years before. So if you take, for example, Black and white unemployment rates in 1948, it turns out that they're roughly equal. That doesn't sound like you need to have reparations for the labor market. You then introduce a minimum wage law. Black labor got lower wages at that time because of lower skill levels. And now, in effect, the minimum wage law started to change the distribution of Black and white unemployed workers. And so what you then do is you have the situation today where there are very strong differences. So the question is, do you want to attribute this to slavery or systematic racism? No, I think what you want to do is attribute this kind of behavior to the sort of well-intentioned legislation that sometimes backfires when you start to put it into effect. This is true of a large number of particular programs. And so if you wanted to think, for example, about zoning type situations, these are generally thought to be highly attractive, but the net effect of many zoning laws has made it impossible to builders to put up apartment houses of modest means in areas close to public transportation, which would allow people to get themselves to work. And so what I think you want to do is not think first about reparations as a problem for this situation, which is going to create real differences of opinion as to how much is owed and who is going to be eligible. I think what you first want to do is to see what kinds of barriers that you have towards progress, which can be removed. And the advantage of doing it by way of removal is that it doesn't require you to have a very rancorous debate as to how much taxes have to be paid, who is going to get which kind of benefit, what the total levels are going to be, what the budget is, who is going to be eligible. I saw one story about a person who claims to be, and I'm sure it's true, a descendant of a slave on the one side and a white person on the other side. Do they owe reparations to themselves? I think if you can clean this thing up by essentially improving opportunities, this would be better. Let me give you a kind of a figure which I think sort of helps make this point a little bit clearer. You start looking at labor performance in minority communities and so forth. It turns out they do better under Donald Trump than they do under Barack Obama. Why is this? Because Trump was essentially less of a regulator on these domestic issues than Obama was. And if you're less of a regulator, you're going to get rid of the taxes and other barriers to entry. And low-income workers will do much better when these barriers are lifted because they constitute a very large fraction of their wages than people who are on the other side of the distribution. And so therefore, again, a program of market liberalization is going to start to achieve this. And the same thing could be said in virtually every other market that you want to talk about. We talk about health difficulties and so forth. Let me again mention one of the serious problems. In 1912, there was something known as the Flexner Report, put together by a very distinguished physician at Johns Hopkins University. And what they advocated was for very high standards for medical schools. The net consequence of that was to close down large fractions of the Black medical schools that had existed and even thrived under a system of segregation. And so this is a classic illustration where a well-intentioned informer starts to create the very kinds of difficulties that we start to avoid. I am a classical liberal. I don't believe in no government. I do believe in a strong government that does certain things. But I think programs that are put into place that are trying to improve the lot of any group by taxing one in order to give to another, for whatever motivation, will in the end backfire and leave everybody worse off than they were before. So as I start to look at this particular situation, I think what we should do, and I guess I have about a minute, is that right, Chauncy?
Yes,
is that you want to look also at some of the achievements so you get a better perspective of this. It took a lot of guts to get John Brown v. Board of Education through. Not at the time, it was not an easy decision. It took a lot of work to get the 1964 Civil Rights Act through, the Voting Acts right of 1965, which made a huge difference. And I think what you want to do is to celebrate the success of some of these programs. So where there were systematic exclusions from the polls all the way through the 1950s and 60s, by the time you get to the 2000s and 10s and 20s, the level of Black participation in many districts is higher than that of white participation. This suggests that we've done something and we've done something right. So rather than, I think, constantly concentrate our attention on the deficits that exist, I think we have to have a more balanced approach, which starts to look at some of the benefits that have been obtained. And so with that, I turn it back to you, Chauncy. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Epstein, thank you so much. And for our people joining us here for this debate, once again, I want to remind you, if you have any questions for either of our speakers here this evening, you can just put it right there in the chat for the U of H live stream. We want to go now to round two, starting with the affirmative response and clarification to what Mr. Epstein said. You have 5 minutes. I'll hand it back over to you, Mr. Ray.
All right, thank you. So, I always find it interesting in America that we always try to pat ourselves on the back for just doing the right thing. That's kind of how this conversation goes. That's what I essentially just heard. I want to make a few points. First, this is not about who has done well, meaning Black people have done well. This is about a debt being paid. When you go to the hospital and there is an accident and someone is accidentally killed in forms of malpractice, the debt paid does not matter whether the family has money or not, whether or not they save or not. It is about addressing the wrong. That's what this is about. For some reason with Black people, we always move the needle. We got to stay on track. We're talking about a debt that is owed. Let's talk about who should pay. Well, this is the big thing. This is not about individuals. This is about a nation. When money was paid out to Jews from the Holocaust, Germany paid that out. When money was paid out to Japanese Americans who were interned, the United States paid that out. Individuals do not pay that out. But part of what happens is it's difficult for people to separate their own individual identity from the United States as a nation. And that's one of the problems that we must do. The other thing is every white person was not responsible for Japanese internment, but the United States paid it, not the people, the United States. Again, every German was not part of the Holocaust. I spent time in Germany. I taught at the University of Mannheim. I studied what was happening there and how they went about healing themselves. The United States is quite far behind that. The other thing is there were people who came after World War II, and their tax money was paid for Jewish Americans, which, mind you, for Japanese Americans who were interned, their reparations did not come through until 1988. See, we have to be clear about the history that this wasn't something that was happening immediately. Let me go to 3 other points. First, let's talk about savings. Research actually documents that Black people are actually more frugal with their money. They just have less wealth. Irregardless of that, that really doesn't even matter because we're talking about a debt that's owed. Like, you don't think about allocating money for somebody who has some kind of malpractice accident on whether or not they're going to save the money or not. We only do that with Black people. The other thing is when it comes to systemic racism is unfortunately a part of American society. Calling the way that Dr. Epstein mentioned, I think used the term systematic racist as if they are individuals. That's not what we're talking about here. Systemic racism is not part of individuals. And as Dr. Eduardo Bonilla-Silva would say, that racism can exist without racists. This is about racism operating on a systemic level. I'm gonna try to take 60 to 75 seconds and really try to summarize this so that people understand what's happening here. Quick sociological note. Racism operates on 3 primary levels: an individual level, a meso level, and a macro level. I'll focus on the 2 polarizing ends. On the individual level, that's the way people primarily view racism, as if a person is engaging in racism against somebody else. That happens, sure. What we're talking about, though, is the way that racism is baked into our policies, our rules, our laws, and our regulations. I'll give you a few examples. Let's take the fact that if you just happen to live in a predominantly Black neighborhood, your house is instantly worth about $50,000 less. It can be the same builder, it can be built at the same time, and in fact, you can have it appraised, and it will appraise for less than it costs to build. That actually just happened in Prince George's County, which happens to be the most affluent Black African-American county in the United States. If it happens here, it's happening everywhere. This isn't about what people are doing that they're supposed to be doing. Another thing, let's go down to Georgia and talk about the trial of the McMichaels, who are on trial for murder for Ahmaud Arbery. In a town that is over 50% Black, there's only 1 Black person on the jury. And the judge actually said that this seems a bit discriminatory. That is an example of how racism becomes baked into the judicial system to impact the outcomes that we're talking about. We also know that if you attend predominantly Black schools, you're less likely to get funding per student. You're less likely to obtain a job because if you have a Black sounding name, say like Rashawn. And then we also know that Black people, even when you attend an Ivy League school, you are actually have a similar rate at getting a job as a white person who attends a state university. Comparatively, a white person who attends an Ivy League school has a much higher chance. So we see that unfortunately, it's not about what people look like on paper, it's about other things. And we know that when homes are appraised, they continue to be devalued. Bottom line is this: systemic racism inhibits people's ability to actualize all aspects of the American dream. And when it comes to thinking about how reparations should be allocated and where they come from, here it goes, and I'll talk about this a little bit later as well. Over 2 billion acres of land in the United States is federal land. Federal land represents 25% of all land in the country. Anybody who owns property knows you can sell it, you can lease it, you can rent it out. That is how reparations can be paid. And talking about under Donald Trump, let's talk about that. In 2018, Donald Trump actually authorized the availability of over 2 million acres of public land in Utah. This was the largest release of public land in U.S. history at a modest rate of $25,000 an acre. This equates to $50 billion. And part of thinking about that money is money that can be allocated for programs to firmly address the root cause of this problem, which is slavery in the United States.
All right, thanks a lot, Mr. Ray. I want to go back to Mr. Epstein. You have 5 minutes on the opposing response and clarification to Mr. Ray.
Thank you. Let me start off with the question about is the debt. And it turns out there are many complicated debts, and they're sometimes collective, as Ray as Mr. Ray says. But if you start looking at the kind of situation, it's important to remember that there are also statutes of limitations that are imposed with respect to these rates. In every single case in which reparations has been paid, and they've been paid to the individuals who've received it. And if it turns out that you can't do it within that particular time, you do not do it at all. When you did the Japanese reparations, they were paid by the nations because it was national policies that did it. I understand all of that, but you did not do it with respect to the descendants. So the question then is there a situation why these debts are completely open-ended in terms of the way in which they go, so that at no particular point could you ever decide that they are done? And we're talking here, if you're talking about slavery, about an institution that ended in the United States about 160 years ago. And if you start talking about what happened since that time, and you're trying to figure out what did happen in there, the question you have to ask is, if you're going to start to think about this as a debt, you start to think about some of the various programs that were made, often huge transfer programs, particularly in more recent years, as though it's a down payment with respect to that debt. And so it's not just a question of looking at that particular time, you start looking at these programs. And if you're trying to figure out the amount of wealth that has been transferred from white individuals to Black individuals through a whole variety of programs, this is going to turn out to be a fairly substantial number. And if you're trying to figure out what the debt is that you're trying to liquidate, there's really no way to do it. The great tragedy about the gains that were made by individuals who owned slaves is that they destroyed the economy. They hurt everybody. They themselves got some kind of benefit, but the benefit that they got was not shared by anybody else. In fact, slavery hurt all sorts of individuals, both white and Black, because it destroyed labor markets and made the overall country far less prosperous than it turned out to be. And so I don't think when you want to start about this thing, you want to treat this debt as though it's somehow a sanctified social thing. Debts are very complicated. As the time goes on, it turns out that the claim for their repayment under these sorts of situations are weaker than you might otherwise expect. And then you're trying to figure out what it is that we talk about with systemic racism being baked into the kind of system. Well, I mean, there are many cases in which there are programs that have disparate impact. But again, before you just quote a single statistic, what you have to do is to try to figure out what's going on. So if you say that, yes, well, it turns out you have an identical house in a Black neighborhood that you have in a white neighborhood, and therefore they ought to appraise the same, somebody's going to come back at you and says, well, what's the rate of maintenance that you've had on this house? Then they're going to start, what's the caliber of the schools you have in the neighborhood? What's the level of crime that you start to have? And when you start to do that, you then may be able to find out kinds of situations in which it turns out that they're perfectly rational explanations apart from racism, why it is that these kinds of differences start to exist. Then when you start looking at the kinds of programs that we have today, do we count this against reparations? If you start looking at the admission standards at an Ivy League school, you find out that the number of points that you have to score on the SAT if you're white are far higher than if you're Asian, even higher still when it turns out that they are Asian people is against Black people, the whole situation. Then you start looking at that, well, now then they graduate, what's going to happen? Well, again, you have to control for various things. They have weaker academic credentials going in. The question that you ask is when they're going out, what are going to be the majors? So if it turns out that your white students go into petroleum engineering and quantitative subject matters, they're going to get much higher incomes than somebody who starts to go into a liberal arts field. You have to control for these things before you start to make very strong judgments one way or another about whether or not the institutions in question have done it. Then, of course, one of the things that we said back in 1964 about racial discrimination is that the dominant form of this was intentional. And indeed, it was intentional. Now people are saying it's not intentional, it's just baked into a particular system, but also baked into the system are institution after institution and party after party who are dedicated in every way, shape, or form to eliminate the vestiges that we've had with respect to segregation. And so instead of talking about what's quote unquote baked in implicitly, we also have to speak what's baked in explicitly. And in the United States, there is no formal policy that is put into place today which is designed to perpetuate anything that was done which was wrong at any other time. And so as you start to go through all of these particular programs, it seems to me that trying to figure out how you rectify wrongs that took place 160 years ago is a dead loser. If you're trying to figure out what's going on more recently, you cannot just simply form one particular side and say it's the systematic stuff that you did is bad. You have to also look at the other side on this and figure out what the offsets and so forth are. You know, I'm old enough to remember what it was like living in the United States when Brown v. Board of Education came down. I was 11 years old at the time. And you could see the segregation. You knew everything that was going on. The transformation in American life in both the public and the private spaces has been nothing short of spectacular since that time. And so to try to say that all of this stuff is somehow or other an image because of what's been baked in, it seems to me that when we start to look at these things, it's absolutely critical that we take into account the positive achievements that have been made, give them due credit, and then try to build on those. And I think the effort to try and go back to past claims and to say it's a collective debt that is owed from 150 years ago will not work. I think if you're trying to do it on systematic racism, the claim is sufficiently fuzzy in so many ways. There's so many counterfactuals that it's not going to work at that point today. I appreciate why it is that there are things that are owed and why people are duly upset. I am certainly in favor of any institution that is private that wants to make voluntary contributions to any particular program for any reason is certainly to do so. And if Georgetown University wants to make a program which will help the descendants of slaves, by all means, they should be able to do so. But I think that in the end, we cannot find either in the situation of slavery long gone or the very complicated social patterns that we have today, sufficient grounds to have the huge transfer programs that Professor Ray has advocated.
Gotcha. All right. Our questions are coming in from some members of our audience, but right now we want to give you all a chance to ask each other questions. I want to start with you, Dr. Ray. You can have your first question to ask Mr. Epstein.
All right, great. So, you know, look, I think one of the things about this is if any racism exists similar to sexism, we should aim to dispel it from this country. And as a sociologist, we control for things. We control for a whole lot of stuff. I could send you some studies after this. That's what we do. We control for stuff. My first main question is, as we think about what just happened with the recent election on Tuesday, we know the two cities in particular that are quite different, Greenbelt, Maryland, and Detroit, Michigan, just voted to have reparations commissions to pursue this. These are voters voting in two very different types of communities that I know quite well because I studied at University of Michigan, and then Greenbelt is right down the road from College Park from the University of Maryland. And we also know that in the state of Virginia, that the state legislature recently ruled, and this is important because as you just noted, in Virginia, they elected a Republican governor. And so Republicans and Democrats have came together to actually say that state universities, including the University of Virginia, need to figure out the legacy of how slavery helped to create these endowments like Georgetown. The point of saying this is clearly this has moved into the public space. We could talk about Evanston. We could talk about what's happening in Rhode Island. We could talk about what's happening in Asheville. What is your reaction to these particular public movements and the shift in public opinion and actual voters saying that they want to see reparations move forward?
Look, I certainly think as a matter of democratic legitimacy, if you've got a huge majority of votes that are going to vote for something, I'm not going to turn around and say that it's unconstitutional. The question is, when these commissions get together, exactly what are the arguments going to be made and what kinds of compromises are going to be worked out? And I don't think from the way in which one states the problem, you could do this because there are many other trends that you see at the same time. So, for example, with all the chaos that took place in a place like Minneapolis and so forth, all the movements to essentially get rid of the police department and put in a Department of Public Safety, I think, indicated that there's a lot of uneasiness about some of the more extreme views on that particular side. And so that the whole situation that we have in many cases is much more complicated. So fine, they want to put their commissions together if they're going to vote it and it's by majority. I'm not making a constitutional argument. What I would do, however, is I would say, let's see what you're trying to put together. So you mentioned the University of Virginia. Well, somebody would go back to the history and see what kinds of programs it had. But it's one thing to have a single institution like the University of Virginia figure out what to do, and then to have Congress decide to do this for the entire United States. And I'm very cautious about the latter. I'm always willing to be respectful on the former. In fact, in a particular case, there may be something of sufficient power that I might decide to vote on the other way. I'm not trying to be categorical, except against this kind of global claim that if you look at the United States, all 333 million people in this country should be treated the same way. Okay, so that's my answer.
All right, now, Mr. Epstein, I'll give you the floor to ask Dr.
Yeah.
Ray your question.
I mean, one of the things that we've had in the United States are other kinds of programs which are designed to keep sort of preferences by way of restitution, including the university space. And so if you look, for example, at the University of California system, there is now in place a number of programs which insist that before you even look at the academic qualifications of anybody, you give them an affirmative action study. And the one particular answer that will get you a flunk is to say we ought to do this on a colorblind basis and look at the content of your character and your qualifications and not racial preferences. And so when they did this at the University of Davis, what happened is they virtually got all women and minority candidates and nobody else was through. And so the question I'm going to ask is, do you think that we should use in these universities these kinds of screens before we make our academic appointments, or whether we ought, on the questions of academic hiring, go back to more traditional contexts of merit, worrying about maybe affirmative action at the edges, but not treating it as a precondition for decision? So how do you respond to, or what do you think about that?
Yeah, good question. So I think it's important for people to realize the history here. This is part of a legacy of affirmative action policies in education. And I think we only have to look at in letting Black people were unqualified in. That's always the narrative. But actually, when they did the analysis, they found that actually wasn't the case. And the Supreme Court ruled at that time. They said in 25 years, I think this was 1978, late 70s, they said in 25 years, we hope race is no longer needed to be included to make these assessments. We fast forward to 2003 and we had the University of Michigan case, where in that case, a plaintiff brought a suit forward saying that she didn't get into law school because unqualified Black people were getting in. Again, that's the claim. We gotta think about this history. Part of what's happened in America is that the social construction of race has been used to justify the science of race, meaning genetic supposed differences by race that lead to the justification of exploitation of race for economic gains. So in Michigan, when that case came before the Supreme Court, they said, you know what? We actually didn't find credence in your claim about race, but if you had brought your case about gender, you would have won, because we have definitely been letting men in who have much lower outcomes and lower scores than women do. But we didn't have a big problem with that, did we? We only had a problem when it came to race. Let's go down to Texas, where we are right now in Houston. Part of what happened in Texas, a lot of people know, is a Fisher case, where at University of Texas, a student didn't get in. She said that the reason why she didn't get in is because University of Texas was letting in unqualified Black people. Texas actually did something that was really, really important. What Texas did, similar to Arkansas, started focusing on geographic location. Because one thing they realized is you can take cities like Gary, Indiana, Baltimore, Philly, DC, and you can literally take Memphis. You can literally take a map from 100 years ago and put it on top and look at biracial composition, and you see that people have not hardly moved at all. Black people still live in the same location, and white people overall still live in the same location. Unfortunately, segregation has continued, and people only have to look to a 2007 Supreme Court case in Louisville, Kentucky, which has allowed for segregation to creep its head up and expand. The point of mentioning Texas and Arkansas is that what they have is now a policy in Texas that if you're in the top 10% of your class, then all of a sudden you can get admitted. California has a similar policy. Arkansas does it for medical school. Why is that? Because they realize that unfortunately, race and racism is baked into where people end up being able to live, and opportunities are afforded by that. You can be the smartest person on the planet, but if you grow up in an area that doesn't have AP courses, and you're all of a sudden competing with some students down the street where they take an AP course every half an hour, they're going to have a higher GPA because you can inflate your GPA with AP courses. It's not because that student wasn't smart. It's because they didn't have the opportunity. And I know a whole lot of Black kids that are like that, compared to some of the narratives that people think of just people getting into college for no reason. So we have to put the affirmative action and the court cases in a proper context. The point is this: when the Supreme Court ruled on the University of Texas case, you know what they said? The same thing they said in the Bakke case. They said, we hope in 25 years, race won't have to be used. And unfortunately, we're still here because we haven't been willing to fully admit and grapple with the depths of the way that racism manifests in society.
I want to go to Mr. Epstein. You hear Dr. Ray's talks on this. He talked about the educational deficiencies. He also talked about the racism embedded in the Justice Department and the justice system. He also talked about the Native Americans, Japanese Americans, and the Jews all getting some sort of reparations program with some sort of reparations. When you look at Black Americans as being the only group to not have some kind of system of redress, and you hear the term a debt that is owed, what comes to mind, and why don't you think a debt is owed?
Well, first of all, I mean, at least in the United States, there's never been a program of Jewish reparations. I mean, what you were talking about was the German program, not the American program. And I think it's important to understand, and that's notwithstanding the fact that if you go back to the 1930s, there was an enormous amount of discrimination against Jews. If you listen to Father Coughlin talk and rant in the 1930s, it was a really horrific experience. And my own father basically never could outgrow that sense that there were people who were after him from all sorts. So that's at least the background. I think the answer is you can say that there are debts owed at one particular point in time, but then you also have to say that the defense is to paying the debt, at least now. And one of the payments that you start to worry about is who are going to be the recipient. It turns out that some people you're going to talk about are people who have 1/5 of slave owners or 1/10 previous slaves, but they're intermarriage in many ways. Are they part of the paying class or are they part of the non-paying class? You don't have that problem when you're looking at this with one generation. You know exactly who it is. The moment you go to 8 generations, it turns out that there's probably nobody, all of whose ancestors were slaves. And there are going to be more people, obviously, who have no slavery. But you can't simply find the clarity with respect to the they who are to be paid that you were under the other type of situation. It also turns out that there's so many other things that have been done in response to this, not in a formal program of reparations, but in effect, which have had enormous benefits under these circumstances. I can assure you, notwithstanding what Professor Ray said, affirmative action programs are alive and well in universities. And in fact, when I wrote about the Michigan case, the position I took may surprise them a bit. I said, there are gaps that you're going to have to worry about in the educational system. You can't pretend that they're not there. But my standard in trying to figure out how a public university ought to dole out its stuff is to look at private universities, and to the extent that they are constantly engaged in this kind of activity. Indeed, I've run an affirmative action program myself when I was a dean for a very short period of time. Public institutions should have exactly the same way. And so I've disagreed in terms of affirmative action programs with the Supreme Court when it says you ought to apply a public colorblind system. But on the other hand, I certainly want to do a colorblind system when it comes to criminal offenses. So I think the answer is there are a lot of decentralized ways to start to deal with these things, and trying to do this at a natural level is going to provoke a firestorm of protest by all sorts of people. And I think if you could decentralize the inquiry, you'll probably get a better response to it than if you try to make it an all or nothing thing, particularly at this point in time when tensions are so high. And we know what the movement intentions have been. The governorship in Virginia essentially was a shocker. And what was it about? It was about educational takeover on the one hand, and some of it was surely about what people thought to be the excesses of all the 1619 projects and so forth. So decentralization, I'm in favor of. And the reason I'm in favor of it is you get more coherent communities, you get more of them, and you don't have to have a national debate, which could quickly degenerate into a national brawl if you're not careful.
Gotcha. But Mr. Epstein, what do you say to those Black Americans who feel like, you know, in their heart of hearts, you know, that a debt, you know, is there, and they're still feeling some of the trickle down effects? We're talking about years and years and years later. What do you say to those people? Do you say, I'm sorry, good luck in the future? How do you reconcile that?
Well, as I told you, what I said is I think the greatest problem with respect to much of Black progress has been programs that were designed to create a system. I was very clear about that. I mean, you get rid of a minimum wage law, which has disparate impacts upon Black individuals, you're doing an enormous good. And so if you start looking at the patterns of regulation that have started to take place, whether you're talking about zoning or whether you're talking about labor markets, whether you're talking about admissions into medical schools, they're all barriers to entry. So the first thing you want to do in any situation is get rid of the barriers. And then what you do is you see open up. Now, on the other hand, there's something else that goes on. There are a lot of foundations in the United States, a lot of universities and so forth. Many of them have programs which are designed to deal with this kind of rectification. I am completely in favor of any private group that wants to do this being able to do it, because I think when you do it on a voluntary side, you avoid all the political risk. So if you then start to go and put all of this stuff together, what happens is you're going to say, look, I mean, there are many things that have gone wrong, but the things are going to be better for you now than they've ever been before. And oh, by the way, you should also understand that, 100 years ago, some of the problems we see with Black families and illegitimacies did not exist. You have to explain why it is, and you can't blame it on slavery. What you have to do is to figure out what particular rules, whether they be welfare rules or family support rules and so forth, that cause this stuff. That requires you looking very closely at things. And I'm all in favor of doing that stuff. But I think, in effect, a national program which starts to say that you have to pay through Congress is too risky under these circumstances, because the people who are going to have to pay the practice are going to say, why me now? All the other cases can be distinguished on the grounds they paid it to direct victims at the time of the wrong. And this is going to be very different. Systematic racism doesn't cut it as a discrete source, and slavery is simply too far back.
Mr. Ray, I want to go to you now. When we talk about asking for money, that's the easy part, asking. The hard part is figuring out where this money comes from. According to William Darity, a Duke University professor of economics and public policy, he also studies reparations. He thinks it's going to cost an upward amount of $12 trillion, or roughly $800,000 per eligible family. Where do we get that money? How do we pay for this? And number two, how do we determine who's eligible, and what system is going to be in place to make sure that that is done right?
Yeah, I mean, look, these are the two of the central questions. Let me answer them. I've thought about it a lot, done a lot of research on it, done work with Dr. Sandy Darity. And so part of thinking about this first question is, who should pay? Where should the money come from? As I said earlier, federal land is the answer. Some Republicans actually support this idea. It's right in line with conservative principles. Over 2 billion acres of land only in the United States is federal land. That's 25%. As I mentioned earlier, you can do a lot of things with that land. You can lease it, you can sell it, but accordingly, that is right in line with the 40 acres and a mule. Right in line with it. This means that if we think about that $12 trillion that Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullins laid out, his wife, this means that 480 million of the 2 billion acres of land could be sold or auctioned off to cover these costs. The land could then be leased to cover wealth building solutions that include, again, as I've mentioned, wealth building strategies, tuition remission, mortgage down payments, and revitalization. The legacy of 40 acres and a mule suggests federal land is the pathway forward. Again, immediately following the Civil War, General Sherman was highly in favor of reparations by using land to do it. And I think we have to think about it in that context. It's also important when we think about land is we have to talk about the Homestead Act. See, the Homestead Act, think about people when you watch Wild Wild West movies. I used to watch Wild Wild West movies with my granddaddy all the time. I used to wonder why people were just in the middle of nowhere creating towns. Well, the reason why that was happening is because Homestead Act money allowed people to head west and claim land. That land was originally for freed Black people. That was wrapped up with the Freedmen's Bureau, where Black people were supposed to put their money together to build wealth. And as they did that, Black people went to places like Tulsa. Not only did places like Tulsa get burned down and lose all that wealth, but highways on I-40 heading from east to west straight through Texas, like it goes through Tennessee and other states, demolished Black cities from Little Rock to North Nashville. Part of thinking about that is that was wealth that was built up. That Homestead Act land was originally for Black people. Let me quickly address the other question of who should qualify. How should we think about this? Well, look, here it goes. One key question is thinking about who should be included. In short, a Black person, and Dr. Sandy Darity says this as well, a Black person who can trace their heritage to people enslaved in the United States should be eligible for financial compensation for slavery. Meanwhile, Black people who can show that they were excluded from various policies after emancipation, such as redlining and segregation, should also seek reparations. But we have to be clear that those are two different things. And we're seeing a lot of movement with Greenbelt and Detroit and Evanston around housing, which is different from slavery. So let me give some specifics. A person like Senator Cory Booker, whose parents are descendants of slaves from Sierra Leone, will qualify for reparations. Whereas Vice President Kamala Harris, whose father is from Jamaica, and mother is from India would not qualify. That just gives an example of how that plays out. Now, let's go to President Barack Obama. He would not qualify. He has a Kenyan father and a white mother, but his wife from the south side of Chicago, Michelle Robinson Obama, would. To determine qualifications, birth records can be used to trace this through census tract documents. One thing that slave owners did, they had good records and they had good documents. People's names are listed. People are able to track that information. I want to quickly say one more thing about what Professor Epstein said. First, he admits that a debt is owed. Bottom line is what we're talking about here. Is a debt owed? Did note that he agrees that it could happen in the private sector, not in the public sector. It's important for people to make that distinction. We agree on that part, the private sector. Where we disagree is what the public sector should do in terms of the federal government. And I think that's where it should happen. The final thing is, I'm actually confused by the argument that he makes that we should continue to remove barriers. Because when I hear that, these are these words we hear. What do you call those barriers? I call them processes of systemic racism baked into social institutions. That's what that word means, barriers. Final point I want to make is programs about welfare. People always like to talk about welfare and act like Black people are the only ones on it. When you look at welfare, 36% of welfare recipients are white, 25% are Black. So while Black people are overrepresented in terms of percentage-wise, there's a much larger number of white people who are on welfare. We have to stop using that argument and act like Black people are the only ones living in poor areas. So I think these are the points that need to be made when we talk about where the money comes from and who qualifies. This is why commissions are set up. These questions are answerable with scientific research that can answer these important questions on how we move forward.
Mr. Ray, I want to go back to when you talk about who's eligible. What about African Americans who arrived here in the U.S. after slavery, but lived under Jim Crow?
When it comes to slavery, they wouldn't qualify. When it comes to slavery, because they're not descendants of slavery in the United States. Now, if they come from a Caribbean island where they were colonized or enslaved, oftentimes by European countries, like we're starting to see movement there in countries in the Caribbean, then they definitely have a claim to make. That claim is not directly with the United States. That claim is with a European country. Similarly to the way that Germany paid out reparations for Jewish Americans, it's the same way that the United States has to pay out for reparations for slavery. The Holocaust happened in Germany. Germany pays it. Slavery happened in the United States. The United States should pay it. So part of thinking about that is that process. The other thing that's important is, even though we know that Native Americans have not received their just due for what happened, but the reparations that has came through, a lot of that came through after people that had been long and gone, generations later. So when we make this argument that that reparations is always going to people who are living, that's just not true. Like, and reparations doesn't solely have to be about individual cash payments. Again, it can be in other forms, but this is part of what commissions will do. They will figure that out. But when it comes to housing, we know emphatically that redlining has had a huge impact on wealth for Black people. And part of thinking about that is similar to what Evanston is doing, similar to what Detroit, Michigan is doing, similar to what Greenbelt, Maryland is about to do. They understand that housing segregation contributes to the race wealth gap in the United States. And that deserves its own atonement, where people who came to the United States after that might actually qualify.
We've got about 30 minutes left here in this great debate. I want to go to Mr. Epstein. We have questions coming in from some of our audience members. This question is for you, Mr. Epstein. Reparations represent a general policy solution for a broad solution or a broad problem that has accumulated over hundreds of years. As Dr. Ray says, a debt owed. So I wonder if your individualistic notion of responsibility doesn't miss the point. Aren't reparations an attempt to make up for a general wrong, regardless of who exactly caused it? Mr. Epstein, your answer.
Well, it certainly is an effort to do that, but I think in effect, it's a dangerous effort to try and do it. Let's go back in effect and start with the number that was given, right? $12 trillion, $8 trillion, $800,000 for family. What you're saying in effect is that the debt of slavery is so sufficiently large that the average Black person who's entitled to get this money will become therefore far wealthier than any white person who is going to have to live, particularly after you take these taxes out by part of the situation. The numbers here are completely wrong. So if you want to talk about this, then go back and think again about the Japanese situation. It was 1988. This is 40 odd years after all this terrible thing happened. The figures were $20,000, which if you then take it back in terms of a discounted situation is a tiny fraction. Reparations then were thought to be an important symbolic situation. And so what you're doing here is you're trying to do this debt and to calculate it in a monetized fashion. You get numbers which are simply unsustainable relative to the problem. If you want to deal with some kinds of situations, I have no objections against somebody trying to acknowledge that slavery was wrong. There are lots of other things that were wrong as well. But what I do think, in effect, is that it's wrong to assume that everybody who is an 8th-generation descendant from slavery is entitled to claim this debt. Professor Ray mentioned throughout this talk that, what the Barack Obama is going to do. But if you start taking people who have multiple origins and they're 1/4 Black and 3/8 Asian or whatever it turns out to be, then these numbers become absolutely arbitrary. And it turns out that if you're trying to do this, two things happen. One is you don't know which entitlements are given to whom. And it's also clear that there is no benefit that descended to other individuals which you could turn back to them. The cases for reparations are most powerful if somebody gets money and there's a stash of wealth that they've taken from somebody else, and then you ask them to give it back to them. But if somebody takes the money, dissipates it, and nothing is left, and you're going to charge his descendants the full cost of this particular debt, when in fact they've derived nothing from it, that is not under individual principles attractive, and it's not attractive as a public matter, because what it does is it inflates these debts beyond recognition. So suppose somebody came forward and said, okay, what we'll do is we'll pay every person $10,000. That's very different from $800,000. I'm not in favor of doing this because I think when the sums get that small, it's not worth the calculation. But when they get as large as you're talking about, there will be a firestorm of resistance to ask people who are essentially going to be poorer than the folks who get the money to sacrifice and to pay taxes under this circumstance. As to the public land solution, that land belongs to everybody. And you could also sell it off and put the money into the public treasury. There's no reason why any one group has a priority to it if they don't have direct claims against other individuals. This is just asking for too much, and one has to try to figure out how to temper it down. And I think when you look at all the confusions that are going to take place, these smaller decentralized programs are going to be much more effective. Put that number on the table and there will be an incredible brawl that will happen. It is not going to be achieved. What you will do is create more animosity and very little by way of transfer.
And that leads us to our next question to you, Mr. Ray, from one of our audience members who says, how important are direct payments to the descendants of slavery versus social programs to help African Americans?
It's a great question. So I think it's an and versus an or. One of the things that my colleague, Dr. Andre Perry, and I have argued for are social programs, essentially a 21st century New Deal that focuses on the pathways to wealth, education, housing, and home and business ownership, the key areas where we know that inequality exists. So part of what it will look like is in education, it will be tuition payments. It will be repayments of student loans. We know that Black people are more likely to carry student loan debt, not because they're not good with their money, but actually because they're more likely to get subprime loans. Accordingly, there was a recent study that came out looking at graduates of historically Black colleges and universities. So for all those people in Texas that go to Texas Southern or go to some of these other universities, and you need to look at what your student loans look like and whether or not you have subsidized or unsubsidized loans, what your interest rates were. This money adds up. We know when it comes to housing, when it comes to redlining, we know that the difference between, say, paying 4% or a 5% loan over a 30-year loan on, say, a $600,000 home could accumulate to over $100,000. That's somebody sending their kid to University of Texas to go to college. So we know that these things are set up. When it comes to business ownership, I talked about that. So focusing on those key gateways is essential in terms of grants. We have to remember, and this gets back, Chauncy, to your question about housing. Around the time when housing inequality was happening with redlining, what was also happening was that Black people were excluded from certain wealth building opportunities as it related to grants for going to school and also grants for starting up small businesses. See, one of the reasons why so many HBCUs exist today is because when those Black veterans returned from war, They couldn't go to University of Maryland. They couldn't go to University of Texas. That's why those HBCUs are right down the road from these large universities. So part of thinking about that is really important to know. The other thing that's important to note is that let's just think about some numbers, because people always throw out numbers. If we look at the recent COVID bailout, that's $4 trillion. $4 trillion that was paid out. The United States had no problem finding that money, and nobody complained about it either. It's interesting how we only complain that things are too much or that it's too much going on when it comes to Black people. The other point is Japanese internment was 4 years. And we can't trivialize it. Like, we can't say only 4 years, because they were interned illegally for 4 years. When we talk about Black people, though, slavery was nearly 250 years. And then there was roughly 80 years of Jim Crow. When we talk about the Holocaust, it was an acute 12-year period. So when we start putting this in its totality and we talk about the gravity of it, we're talking about centuries versus a decade or less. And it's important for people to put that in the proper context.
Gotcha. And we still are here in round 4 taking audience questions, but I want to go back because Mr. Epstein said something that was quite glaring. And this is a response for you, Mr. Ray, because if the goal here is to right the wrong and try to move forward, what do you have to say about Mr. Epstein's point that reparations will cause white resentment and make race relations even worse?
Unfortunately, white resentment already exists. And part of thinking about it is that people who benefit from unearned assets oftentimes resist change to make it equitable. That's just the simple bottom line. You know, progress has never came from people saying we want it to happen. Progress has come from Black people, white people, Asian people, Latino people, Native Americans, all Americans coming together saying this is the right thing to do. And we are at this moment in time where when we talk about reparations, something that we haven't talked about, but is very, very important because, well, actually it came up slightly. Professor Epstein mentioned it slightly talking about Virginia and didn't use the word critical race theory, but was referring to that as kind of this boogeyman that people talk about. And not to put us on a tangent, but the point here is that reparations also has to include restorative justice. That means painting an accurate portrayal of history. See, part of the reason why I laid out some of the history at that beginning is because I guarantee you I said things that people had never heard before. Wasn't taught in school in Texas, wasn't taught in school in Tennessee where I grew up at, not being taught in the other places where I've lived either. And part of thinking about that, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And so part of thinking about that is when we get on the same page in the same book about our American history, oftentimes we come to similar conclusions about how to move forward. For example, 40% of young people considered, say, 18 to mid 30s, 40% of them favor reparations in 2016. It is an even higher percentage today. And when we look at places like Greenbelt, which has a large white population that voted for this commission, when we look at places like Asheville, when we go up to Rhode Island, that is one of the whitest states in the United States of America.
they got money, which they did. They made the rest of the country poorer by wrecking labor markets through forced labors. If this were a case of simply trying to find children and to get them back, every single theory of restitution says that if you receive a grant from somebody who's taken property wrongly, you are obliged to give it back, even though you need. The reason why this problem is very, very difficult is that it turns out that there are no descended assets. And so what you can't do is to say that what we're just doing is taking something that you shouldn't have. All the money, and if you tried to do this to say to many people who are going to have a very heavy tax, if these things you're talking about, you're talking about 100,000 of taxes on a person. That's the kind of number that's being put out here per person to pay. There's just the world is going to blow up. There's going to be no way that that can be done. Then the question is learn about history. Well, I disagree with much of what Professor Ray says about the particular history. And in particular, I think that it would be just very wrong to use the 1619 curriculum to describe what's going on, because the history is much more cross-current. To make the claim that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were designed to preserve slavery ignores the fact that basically the time these things were done, northern states abolished it. When it came to the question of the Northwest Territory in 1786, slavery was abolished and prohibited from going there. Terrible things happened after the Missouri Compromise and so forth. I'm in favor of teaching all of that particular stuff, but I don't think what you can do is to teach it as a history which says all sins were done by one group to another group. I think what you have to do is to understand that there were many things that were terrible and many things that were started to be heroic. And when you start putting that jumble on the table, what happens is it doesn't translate into the kinds of numbers that are being proposed as a starting point for negotiation. $800,000 per person in a country which is roiling in debt, where we can't even find the kind of money that you need to pay for the so-called infrastructure program. This is just a non-starter. And in terms of education, there are many disadvantaged people from Appalachia and so forth who've been on the wrong end of a lot of sticks for a very long period of time. You could have a race-blind program that can do much of this stuff. You do it on a more modest label, but you would do it without creating the political rancor that's sure to follow if you try to make this into a payment system at the magnitude that's been suggested.
All right, thank you. All right, gentlemen, we are going to call this the lightning round. I got a few questions from our audience members, so if you can give me 30-second answers. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Epstein. This question right here is from one of our audience members who says, you make the case that free markets will do more to help African Americans than reparations, but couldn't you still have some sort of market orientation reparations like housing or education vouchers? 30 seconds.
Vouchers are generally a pretty good way to do things because they don't get you involved in specific situations. So I'm in favor of that. The question, though, is why should the class of vouchers only go to some individuals who suffered misfortune as opposed to doing it for others? And one of the things, for example, is that if you actually look at the current politics in the United States, vouchers are opposed by unions. And it seems to me that what we really want to do is to break the public school monopoly. And if we had a voucher program, it would work. In New York City, where we have these programs, huge percentages of the students in the Success Academy, for example, are minority origin, and they do perfectly well. That system can really work, so I'm very strongly in favor of it.
Got you. And we'll go to Mr. Ray. This question is for you. How do we have a forward-moving conversation about reparations, monetary and others, when people want to move past history? How would monetary reparations cure the ills or heal the wounds of racism, or is it really just a matter of making up for inequalities?
Well, I think when it comes to the monetary value, it's about the wrong and dealing with that. And again, when we talk about the money, we can put a financial value on it. Like the physical bodies of slaves was valued at $3 billion in 1860. Accordingly, it becomes important to think about this, that slavery also had a second name known as convict leasing. And when you start talking about states playing a role in this, in Alabama, 75% of Alabama state revenue at the turn going into the 20th century, 75% came from convict leasing. Let's fast forward to today. Well, this part of this $4 trillion in COVID money going to Alabama is being used to put up new prisons. Who's going to probably be in those prisons? Overwhelmingly Black people that's dealing with some of the issues that we're talking about. The other part of this, though, is that the reparations package isn't solely about finances. It's also about restorative justice. Part of restorative justice is about ensuring that all of us get exposed to the proper history in the United States. Congresswoman Barbara Lee has a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The state of California does as well. People should look there because I think that is how we heal. Because right now, what's happening is the United States has an open wound that's never healed. Think about an injury you had or a cut that you never let heal. You never put Neosporin on it. You never did what you were supposed to do to make it heal. And now it needs surgery. And part of that surgery means it's going to take a little bit longer to heal because you need surgery. That's where we are in the United States. If we don't heal this wound, it will just keep getting wider.
Got you. All right, we've got about 12 minutes left. We want to try to find some common ground here. Our audience members are asking for it. So this question is for both Mr. Epstein and also Mr. Ray. Is there some common ground between the debaters here? Could you both agree to something like special housing credits or student loan forgiveness for African Americans under the name reparations? Is there any common ground from both of you all on this? I want to start with you, Professor Epstein. 1 minute.
Well, I think the answer is I'm not in favor generally of forgiveness of student loans, certainly on a broad basis, because what happens is that many of those benefits go to the most privileged individuals, and it creates a kind of vertical inequity. Many people got their loans and paid them off in full. Now you're going to get another generation of people, and they don't have to pay them at all. So I think that this is kind of tricky. What I am in favor of, as I mentioned, is a program that breaks the public monopoly and allows people to get vouchers regardless of race so as to use them. It turns out in these particular programs, there are huge numbers of minority participants in them. And I think if you do this on a race neutral basis, you're going to get the disparate impact you like without having the particular problem that you start to face. In general, I'm not in favor of housing things. As I said before, I think the greatest thing that you can do is to provide basic security against crime, and there's huge black on black crime that has to be dealt with, and I think that's there. And otherwise, what you try to do is to get more people in there so that what happens is the supply of housing increases, the cost of housing goes down, and the situation will be better. You want to talk about a terrible program in terms of racial discrimination. Try rent control in New York City, where virtually all the privileged people who get these huge subsidies turn out to be white people of privilege who got them back in the 1940s. I'm not in favor of keeping those things. I think you got to transition out. And so always deregulate first before you get positive wealth transfers.
Gotcha. All right, Mr. Ray.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm unsure how much we connected there. I mean, again, I know that Professor Epstein does agree that things can happen in the private sector, and I definitely think that's the case. I think it's a few things, though, for people to know on this point that I think is important to respond to. First thing is that when it comes to vouchers that will be for everyone, that's no different from a whole bunch of other programs that's been done, where Black people and people who know that a wrong has been done and needs to be atoned for, including a large number of white people who are pushing for this, that oftentimes when these benefits come down, they come down on the backs of Black people. This is another example that Professor Epstein actually highlighted, which is that, oh, well, everyone should be able to get these vouchers, even though they should probably be exclusively for Black people. We're not going to do that. No. When it comes to affirmative action, what's interesting there is that affirmative action has benefited women just as much as it has Black people. And affirmative action expands to not just include gender and race, but to think about religious discrimination, particularly for Jewish Americans as they continue to experience hate crimes, and also disability. Two other quick points. First is related to Black on Black crime. That's a statement we hear all the time. 94% of Black people are killed by other Black people. 94%. But you know what's interesting about that? 86% of white people are killed by other white people. And we never say white on white crime. Why is it that it's Black on Black crime? Crime should just be crime. We should want to solve it. But the reason why we're able to say Black on Black crime and we don't say white on white crime, even though crime is intraracial, is because that speaks to housing segregation. People oftentimes commit crimes by people they're exposed to, by people who they see. The reason why most Black people end up killing other Black people is because they live next door to them. The reason why 86% of white people kill other white people is because they live next door to them. There are only 2% of census tracts. Census tracts are really small. They're much smaller than zip codes. Only 2% of census tracts have a similar percentage of whites, Latinos, Asians, and Black people who have a similar level of education and income. Only 2% in the entire United States. The final point here is about policing. if we want to deal with policing, there's a key statistic that we should all want to solve. Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they're not attacking and don't have a weapon. 3.5 times more likely. We're not talking about people who were attacking. We're not talking about people who had a weapon. Who says that? Police themselves. There are some key statistics and tons of research out there that show these disparities if we actually want to approach them head on and do something about it.
Gotcha. All right. As we close here, I want to give each of you all 2 minutes here for a closing statement on your side. This has been a great conversation, and you all have done so well with making and bringing your points home. I want to start with you, Mr. Epstein. You have 2 minutes here in your closing statement.
Well, the situation in the United States is extraordinarily complex. And there are many things that we do today that are unrelated to race formally, but which have enormous disparate impact on the way in which these things go. I'm interested in trying to find a way in which we can improve the lot of all Americans by trying to have programs that are not divisive in the way in which they are put together. Deregulation in many cases do that. Programs like vouchers will do that. Improved police protection will do that. Professor Ray is surely right when he says there's white on white crime and black on black crime. What is missed from that is that the rate of crime on black and black as a percentage of population is far, far higher than it is on the other side. And so when you start to see people calling for the relaxation of police enforcement, it's going to result in a much higher increase in black on black crime than it is on white crime. And what you therefore have to do under these circumstances is to figure out how it is you get equitable enforcement to make sure that these things do not happen. It's also absolutely critical to try to have educational opportunities for everybody. And in these particular circumstances, getting rid of the public school monopoly, I think, is much more to the point. If you start looking, for example, at the performances in the Success Academy that I referred to, here are kids in the worst of these schools that imagine come from the family. They have scores that are comparable to those of the kids who live in Scarsdale, New York, an upper middle class factory. And my son worked in these schools, and one of the things they start to say is the last thing we care about when we teach our children is whether or not they're all black, all white, or some mix between them. We think that we're trying to improve their kids, and if we give them the right environment, doesn't matter whom they sit next to, we've got to be able to do it. So I'm in favor of trying to do each and every one of these things. What I do not think is going to be appropriate is to put an enormous number on the table as to what you think to be inherited by simply taking a situation where you figure out what the loss was and then compound it by interest in 150 years and try to give it to the descendants. One has never been able to do that formula anywhere else. You should not try to do it here. So if you're going to try to play the reparations situation, I'm certainly going to see that people are going to try it. I'm not saying you can't do it. I think what you really have to do is to start with a much more realistic assessment. And if you start thinking about the Japanese number as being a sign of a combination of a little compensation and a lot of symbolic stuff, you're going to get a lot farther. You may do this in local situations, but if you could talk about 1 billion people or 2 million people on these commissions, you have to worry about nationally that there are probably thousands and thousands of communities that are not prepared to entertain this. And that if you start to put this globally, they're going to kill it all off at the national level. You're not going to get success with the kinds of numbers you've had. What we have to do is to essentially try to deregulate, try to help in spots, and we can improve the situation far more, including affirmative action programs, which, as I've said before, I am certainly not opposed to in either the private or the public sector.
Mr. Epstein, thank you so much. 2 minutes, Dr. Ray.
Yeah. So look, research documents that hard work or lack thereof, intellect or criminality do not explain the outcomes when we talk about the racial wealth gap. Instead, unfortunately, it is that racism is deeply embedded within our social institutions, our policies, our rules, our regulations, our laws that segment people's experiences along racial lines. It's the same for gender. Women can achieve, but have a much harder time doing so than men. If not, America would have had a woman vice president and a speaker of the House sitting behind the president long before 2021. Part of thinking about this is that what people seem to not realize is that being upwardly mobile does not negate encountering racist hurdles on the pathways to success. Our current system is set up for some people to have to jump over hurdles to succeed, while others simply get to run to the finish line without experiencing those hurdles. Rather, it is about creating equitable pathways to success. This is what America says. It is an equitable democracy. That's part of what we call ourselves. And part of thinking about this equitable democracy is that people are pushing for America to reach its true ideals. Part of reaching our true ideals is that the only way this can properly occur is acknowledging that there are barriers, as Professor Epstein said, systemic barriers that prevent us from getting there. Moreover, it is not that racial progress has not been made. It is that the United States has yet to make enough progress. In this regard, comments of certain people oftentimes become disappointing. Black people who succeed often walk on pins and needles because they realize that their success, and more so maintaining it, is precarious. As a result, some Black people aim to make white people feel comfortable. Many of us are mostly socialized to do so. It is often a survival strategy for our lives during police encounters or economic survival in boardrooms. Some of us who succeed may experience survivor's remorse because we are some of the few that have made it. But you know what? We actually embody the American dream and become the in-person example to people who do not want to admit that systemic racism exists. We may even convince ourselves that racism is more prominent on the individual level than the institutional level. But in closing, we simultaneously represent racial progress, but are also most likely to be subjugated to racial discrimination because of the predominantly white spaces we are embedded within. We experience a chronic form of double consciousness, as W.B. Du Bois highlights, and admitting so can oftentimes lead to a slow death that we experience through the cumulative racial cuts and hurdles we encounter. The American dream being achievable for a few does not absolve the system and an imperfect union, even when some of those successful people try to rationalize the racism away. We can do better as a nation. We must do better. Let's get past this open wound. Let's heal. And the best way to do it is through reparations.
Mr. Ray, thank you so much. Here in our last minute, it is now time for our audience to take the closing poll on tonight's debate. If you're logged into the U of H live stream site, please take a moment right now to indicate your opinion. We know we did a poll at the beginning. Now this is the closing poll after hearing tonight's debate on whether you think the U.S. government should pay reparations for slavery and racism against the Black community. The closing poll, you'll see there, it states, having listened to the debate, do you think the U.S. government should support some policy of reparations for Black Americans, yes or no? Please go ahead and make your votes there in the closing poll. Now, while we are waiting on those results to come in, I'd like to thank both of our speakers here for this very civil and informative debate on such an important issue and an important topic that we've been talking about for years, and I hope we will continue to talk about. I also like to thank the Gelwick family for supporting this event, and also encourage all of our viewers to please visit the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership's website for a recording of tonight's debate and other upcoming events. And of course, tonight's debate will also be available on abc13.com and also on our streaming and digital platforms. All right, we're going to see if these poll results will come in. We know before, at the beginning, the pre-poll results, we had 74% of people believed in some kind of reparations, 10% voted no, and 15% were undecided. Once again, that was the pre-poll results. Yes, 74%, 10% no, and 15% undecided. Now we want to take a look here at our post-poll results and see if any hearts or minds have changed. All right, so the results are in. We have, and this is to the question, having listened to the debate, do you think the U.S. government should support some policy of reparations for Black Americans? Yes or no? According to the post-poll results, yes at 97%, no at 2%. Once again, 97% of people saying yes to some sort of reparations program, 2% saying no. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for joining us here for this very great debate here. It is very thought-provoking, and I wish you well in your careers and as you all continue to talk on the subject. And thank you all so much for joining us here for this debate. For ABC 13 and the Hobby School of Public Affairs, I'm Chauncy Glover. Have a great evening.